Dr. Christian Miller, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's really good to have you on the show and to have this opportunity to meet you and to delve into your very fascinating work and your book that's about character. You're a philosopher, and I know you've reviewed a lot of the psychology literature as well in regard to character. What's the difference between the way a philosopher approaches character and the way a psychologist addresses character?
So there are probably many differences. The one that stands out for me is that philosophers tend to think abstractly apart from empirical data. So that's been the kind of traditional approach of philosophers, is to kind of sit in your armchair. It's probably a stereotype, but sit in your armchair, think deeply about big questions like the meaning of life and the existence of God and where does morality come from. Whereas psychologists wrestle with the messy details of life, the empirical data that they gather in their controlled experiments, and then they analyze and report their findings. Now, when it comes to character in particular, I think I want to say that we have different responsibilities or can make different contributions. Philosophers can think about what is a good character, what does good character look like, what is a virtuous person, for example, but they can't tell us much about how character actually is today. What most people's character actually is today. For that, we need some empirical data. That's where the psychological studies can come in and be very helpful. So psychological studies can tell us, what do people do in this situation? What do people do in that situation? Do people lie or not lie, steal or not steal, cheat or not cheat, harm or not harm? But what the psychologists can't do as psychologists is draw ethical inferences or normative inferences from that data. They can't tell us whether people are behaving well or how they should be or should not be behaving. That's the responsibility of the philosopher. So the philosopher is doing more theoretical, and the more normative, the psychologist is doing the more empirical.
Yeah, good. Actually, I was a philosophy minor, I think, in college, and so I got some of that bug implanted in me.
Good for you.
And it sounds like you've got a foot in both worlds, because you've included a lot of psychological research amongst your philosophical meanderings.
That's
Meandering is probably too general.
Yes, that's correct. So I don't, to be clear, I don't do any studies myself. So I'm not trained in psychology. I don't have a PhD in psychology, but I want to read what others have done, the studies of others have carefully done, and then benefit from that in my own research, draw conclusions from that in my own thinking about what character actually looks like and what it should look like.
Yeah. Well, I know you've got a lot of psychological research studies under your belt in terms of, they're in your book and you know about them. And feel free to illuminate our discussion with any of those that come to mind, since I'm a psychologist and this is a podcast kind of about psychology. But of course, philosophy and psychology are old friends.
That's
Psychology having evolved kind of out of philosophy.
That's right.
Now, your current book, The Character Gap, and that's such a evocative title right there. It says a lot, The Character Gap. And it draws on data and learning from a group that you created about 10 years ago called the Character Project. And in fact, you're the philosophy director of another thing called the Beacon, and the Beacon Project. And that's funded by a $3.9 million grant from the Templeton Foundation. And you are also past director of the Character Project, another thing that you, I think, pioneered. And that got another $5.6 million.
That's correct.
In grants from Templeton again. Can you send a little money my way? Well, I'd be betraying poor character in saying
yes, that's
that.
right. It's especially bad for me to do as the Character Project director.
Yeah. So, we might be tempted to think that character is kind of a trivial idea, but evidently not. It sounds like it's been worth about close to $10 million from the Templeton Foundation. One of the things Well, I'll give you a chance to explain, tell us something about both of those
Sure,
uh, activities that you've been so involved with.
sure. So Templeton, for throughout its history, the Templeton Foundation has cared very seriously about character. And about 10 years or so, they knew that there was a lot of work going on character at Wake Forest, not just myself, but several psychologists over in our departments, leading personality psychologists, were doing a bunch of studies there. And so they thought this would be a great place to invest money in making an internationally impactful and relevant foundation or project on the topic of character. So what the vision was that they would fund our work here, and we would then advertise throughout the world for new projects on character
Hmm.
from the perspectives of philosophy, psychology, and theology. Anyone who is an academic doing new interesting work in those fields could apply to us, and we would review the applications and then fund the best projects. Templeton can't be an expert on every subject. They only have so many people there, but they can identify centers of expertise around the world and then support those centers, which in turn can identify the best researchers doing the best work and help them out. So what we did over the course of the 5 years of the Character Project was fund 28 projects in the amount of $3 million total, all around the world in the area of character. So to give you a little bit of a sense of what was done there, we had projects in developmental psychology, we had projects in social psychology, personality psychology, we had in philosophy and theology. One project was looking at where character emerges early on in human beings, finding that there's evidence of character even as early as 9 months.
Wow.
9-month-old infants show some signs of awareness of fairness norms, and when
Hmm.
fairness norms are violated. Another project was looking at the famous Milgram experiment,
Yeah.
which of course can't be replicated today, but was using a clever design to come close to replicating it with the help of virtual reality technology. So
Hmm.
creating a virtual reality simulation of the test-taking environments with no real person getting the quote-unquote real shocks, but
Uh-huh.
a virtual reality
Fa-
simulation getting the shocks.
Fascinating.
And then looking at what factors predicted obedience and what factors predicted disobedience to the authority figure in the Milgram setup. So there's a lot to say about what we did over the course of those 5 years, but just to give you, that's the main highlight, is that we were trying to aid new, interesting, and important research on character. In the
Yeah.
in the course of that, we also, Wake Forest, did our own research. So that's where I wrote 2 books, academic books with Oxford University Press, one called Moral Character and Empirical Theory, another called Character and Moral Psychology. And our psychologists did a number of studies gathering over 1 million data points in the 5
Wow.
years. Yes, a lot. So then and I could say more if you're interested about that character project, but what our kind of time ran out, and we were, we used our funding very wisely, I think, and well, but we were not finished. We really worked well together. We collaborated in a very productive manner. So we thought, let's try and continue this relationship. So we proposed a new project, still having to do with character, but focused on the morally exceptional, the best of the best, moral saints, moral heroes, moral exemplars.
Mm-hmm.
And this became the Beacon Project. The idea
Oh,
being they're kind of beacons of moral light, people who
sure.
stand out from the rest as role models and paradigms and exemplars. So we're basically doing the same thing with them that we did with the Character Project. So we're having funding competitions. We're inviting scholars to apply to us with projects but now specifically targeting that class of people. So how do we pick out the morally exceptional? How do they psychologically process the world? How do they become that way in the first place? How can we learn from them and become more like them? So those kind of questions are at the center of our current project, which actually is wrapping up as well. So we're now in year 3 of 3 years, and we'll be finished this summer with our culmination capstone conference.
Wow. So you've really embraced some big ideas and some very large tasks. And I think there's a lot to discuss there that kind of comes to mind. Um, the title of your book is The Character Gap. And what's the gap that you're referring to?
So it's the gap between how most people actually are and the kind of character they should have. So on the one hand, it's just an empirical fact. When you look around the world, what kind of character do most people tend to have? Is it a really good character? Is it a really bad character? Is it somewhere in the middle? And I propose in the book that it's somewhere in the middle. It's a kind of mixed character, a character that has some good sides and some bad sides, and I can say more about that. So that's where we actually are. And then on the other hand, there's the character we should have. The character we should have is a deeply virtuous character, a character that's filled with traits like honesty and compassion and bravery and justice and gratitude and fortitude and these other virtues. So the gap refers to the gap between those two things, how we actually are and how we should be when it comes to character, myself included. So I'm not saying I'm any exception to the rule. There's a big gap in my own life. And so that's how I see matters of character.
So it must be that as you get so deeply into these topics that you're somehow called to do some self-examination in the process. Huh?
That's right.
One of the risks
right,
of going into this area is you may
right.
become uncomfortable.
And for sure, and one thing I've really learned from the psychological research is that it teaches us all kinds of things about ourselves that we didn't know beforehand, or at least about myself. So something like the Milgram experiment, which we've already referred to, really illustrates the power of our desire to obey authority figures.
Yeah.
Before that Milgram research was done, people were surveyed and said, would you ever turn up that shock dial that high and under pressure from an authority figure and kill an innocent test taker? And people said, no way. They would stop long before it got very painful. Well, lo and behold, that's not the case. That unbeknownst to us, there are different facets to our psychology. So another one that I've come to appreciate is fear of embarrassment. So before getting into the research, I didn't appreciate how strong fear of embarrassment is as an inhibitor of helping people when you're in a group. When the bystander effect, the group effect, and how we might not want to embarrass ourselves if we do something that looks foolish in front of others. So it's been very eye-opening to me, not only just how people are in general, but how I am in particular. And of course, I want to think of this not just an academic exercise, but when I write a book like The Character Gap, I want to think about how it can shape me too in the process and how I can try and close that gap in my own life.
Yeah. Yeah. When I first saw The Character Gap, the title, which grabbed me and got me interested, it was hard, though, not to think about the current political situation. And I don't want to go too deep into politics here, but it seems to me that there's a glaring sense of a character gap
Right.
that we're dealing with at this point in time.
Right. And I think that's pretty widely accepted. And it's probably not the only time in history that this has happened, but it seems especially salient right now. And one very unfortunate thing about that is the impact of role models. So all the psychological research on how role models can shape our own character and our behavior, well, depends on what the role model is like. So, positive role models can shape our behavior in a positive way and over time can bring about a character change towards virtue. But negative role models can have the opposite impact. So when the public square is dominated by people who maybe are not exhibiting the best character, that can have a kind of trickle-down effect on the rest of us who look to them as role models. And it can nudge character in different directions. And unfortunately, not so good in that right now, perhaps.
Yeah. The subtitle of your book is How Good Are We? And so I probably should ask you, how are you defining good?
Right. So that I want to stay away from trying to have to answer every possible question in a book like this. So there's just too many questions out there and too much controversy. So what I'm thinking of is how good are we means what does our character look like? And good is good character and bad is bad character. Of course, that just invites the question, what is good character?
Right.
And that I'm going to define in terms of virtuous character. So someone who has a good character is someone who has the virtues. What are the virtues? Of course, it backs the question up one more step. So what is the virtuous character? The virtuous character is one that has a list of, or is a character that has virtues like honesty, compassion, justice, fortitude, courage, and the like. So I think at this point, it's helpful to just pick one and perhaps explore it a little bit more. And then what I say about that one virtue will apply to the other virtues as well, if that makes sense. Um,
Yeah,
so
where do I have this? Is there sort of a universal cross-cultural sense of virtues?
yeah, so virtues in the abstract are universally discussed and valued and celebrated. There is, however, some controversy or some difference across culture as to the exact list of virtues. So
Mhm.
what makes it on the list and what doesn't? So for example, there have been times in the past when humility was on the list, and other times when humility is not on the list, depending upon the dominant philosophy and religion and so forth of the time.
Yeah,
However, my approach is twofold here. One is to try and find areas of agreements rather than focusing on disagreements. So something like honesty, it's been widely celebrated today, cross-culturally and historically, that honesty is a virtue. And I think that's something we can agree on. We can focus on that and try and make progress with respect to honesty, because there's a character gap there too. And the second thing, and this is more directly in the realm of psychology, is that there's very interesting work coming out of positive psychology,
yeah.
going back to the handbook on character strengths that came out in the early 2000s by Seligman and Peterson. And what they did was they identified 24 what they call character strengths, but I would call virtues. And it wasn't just armchair speculation. They had 50 experts who did a very extensive cross-cultural analysis, looking at philosophical systems, looking at religions, even looking at things like Hallmark reading cards and Pokemon games and this kind of thing, to
Mm.
try and extract core virtues which were celebrated across different people groups. And they were successful. I think you might challenge some of the 24. You might say, exactly, does that exactly belong on the list, or did they miss one or two? But yeah, I think you have to have some. What they did was impressive, and I think it deserves our respect as a pretty solid list of 24 character strengths.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about positive psychology because I think that the word virtue kind of enters psychology, modern psychology, with that research that you're talking about. But prior to that, I don't think many psychologists thought about things like virtue. And of course, we're 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 challenged by wondering. I mean, religion has a lot of things to say about character and about what's virtuous and what the virtuous person would look like. So that's one source. I also wonder, well, independent of, if we lay that to the side, is there some other process by which we come to recognize or universally agree? And as I was thinking about that, it occurred to me to look in the index at the back of the book for the word evolution.
Mm.
And I was surprised that I didn't find anything in relation to evolution, because I would think that uh, that virtuous characteristics would have survival value. And
Mm.
so that would lead to some consensus.
Right. So let me take it in two stages here. First, about psychology and what's work is being done in psychology on virtue, and then to the point about evolution. Uh, so you're right. Historically, in the 20th century, virtue was not a prominent topic. This has to do with, if I can give a kind of crude history, there's a lot more detail to it, but with the rise of the situationist movement in the 60s and 70s, which called into question the empirical validity of character traits in general, personality traits in general, cross-situationally consistent and stable personality traits, of which virtues would be a subset. So that movement really cast doubt upon the psychological usefulness of just not just virtues, but personality traits. However, as is well known to you and to your listeners, I'm sure, there was been a resurgence of interest in personality and personality traits. in the 1980s, for example, the Big Five has come to dominate personality psychology, where the Big Five are personality traits which can give a pretty comprehensive picture of our personality. And then from there, it was noticed that there was some discussion of moral character in the Big Five. Agreeableness, for example, is one of the Big Five. And under agreeableness is modesty. That's a facet of the Big Five, agreeableness, but still not too much. So with the rise of positive psychology in the last 20 years, there's been a really intentional focus on the part of psychologists to pay more attention to virtue from an empirical perspective. This is something that is worth studying on research grounds, and that it correlates with all kinds of other things that we care about in life, like life satisfaction, positive mood, decreased stress, lifespan, and so forth. So I think the time is ripe for additional focus on character and virtue, and psychologists seem to be very comfortable with that. At least some psychologists. I can't speak for all, but especially in personality psychology. Now, as far as other sources of thinking about virtue and character are concerned, you're right. Historically, there's been a lot of work in religion. Different religions talk about it and have lots to say, and I think some of it's very valuable. If we leave aside a religious perspective for the moment, there are a couple of other places we could go. One is evolution, and we can come to that in a second. But that's not the only source, though. We can look to things like works of fiction. We can look to our own experience of the world. We can look to philosophical thinking. So just reason, using our minds to think, okay, what does it take to be an honest person? Does an honest person always have to tell the truth, or sometimes it's okay to lie or not? What are the demands of compassion? So philosophers who really emphasize reason can make some progress in thinking about virtue as well. And then you're right, evolution would be something that we would want to look at in more detail too. I didn't do so in this book for, I think, two reasons. One is I'm just not very well trained in the area. I don't have a lot of biological training or evolutionary training in particular. So I'd be nervous about making conclusions that would look foolish in light of the experts, the expert literature. And the second is there's this concern about is ought. So what might be, as a matter of fact, evolutionary conducive is different from, or perhaps it's at least a controversial question, whether it's the same thing as what we ethically should pursue. So it might be one thing that, as a matter of fact, a certain trait is conducive to the survival of the species or reproduction of the species, but that's an empirical observation. It's a different matter when we get into ethics about whether that, in fact, should be promoted.
So, for example, aggression might be...
Right. Perfect example.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect example.
Yep. Yeah, we do struggle with that one.
So I'd be very nervous about, if it turned out that aggression was evolutionary conducive in certain ways, I'd be very nervous about going from that to the moral claim that we should be aggressive, or that it's a weaker claim that aggression is morally permissible. Even that would make me nervous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you did come to the conclusion, both personally and in your own work. Oh, I wanted to back up to something. You've put so much energy into this. When and how did you first become concerned about character? Do you remember?
I guess that's a challenging question. You have me stumped for a moment. I think I can certainly identify the moment where I became interested in it academically. Personally, it probably would have to go back into the high school and things I was reading back in high school. But academically, I first became really fascinated in the topic in college when I started reading work being done in philosophy under the heading of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is a movement in philosophy that says Aristotle had some really promising ideas, and they're worth restoring to the contemporary discussion of morality. So that it's not just utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill, it's not just deontology and Immanuel Kant, but that there's a third way of thinking about ethics, having to do with virtue and character and what a virtuous person would do in a certain set of circumstances that deserves to be taken seriously as a rival and alternative to those two leading theories. This movement started in the 1980s thanks to people like Alistair McIntyre and Elizabeth Anscombe and Philippa Foot and some other philosophers. And that really grabbed my attention because I was not very happy with the leading ways of thinking about ethics in philosophy. And this appealed to me a lot more. And then in the 2000s, some philosophers started reading the situationist literature in psychology. And they said, wait a minute, you people who like virtue and character, you better pay attention to what's going on in psychology.
Uh-huh.
You think there's this new way of approaching ethics, and it goes back to Aristotle, but it's been neglected for a while, and you want to restore it and bring it back to the table. Well, wait a minute. I mean, is there actually any empirical support to the very idea of character and virtue in the first place? And if you look at the research in the 1960s and 70s, seems like it calls into question the empirical evidence, calls into question whether there's any empirical evidence at all for virtue and character. If that's right, then you all are in big trouble. You should stop thinking about virtue ethics and virtue as part of morality and go back to some other alternative approach.
Yeah, because I think many of us have had the impression that when we talk about character or virtue, that we're talking about something that's fixed. In other words, I've internalized some set of values that characterize my behavior throughout my life in a fairly fixed way. But now you were talking about Milgram and we've got the Zimbardo prison experiment, and these things seem to suggest that good systems versus bad systems of government, organizations, religions, hierarchies of authority, and so on, that's getting into that situational thing that you're talking about.
That's right. So this is complicated now. So first a comment on character being fixed, and then a comment on social pressures and norms. If character were fixed, that would be bad news for virtue ethics and for my own research and what I'm interested in. It'd be bad news for character change and development. I spend a lot of time thinking about ways which we could try to better our characters. Well, if they're fixed, then that's pointless.
Mm-hmm.
As far as I know, overwhelmingly, the empirical evidence does not support that position. There were a few people back in the 1980s who held it, but since then, in psychology I'm speaking about now, since then, overwhelmingly people have gravitated towards the view that character can change, but not quickly. So it's going to be slow, gradual change over time if it does change. So I can't snap my fingers and make myself an honest person tomorrow, but perhaps if I engage in the helpful practices and rituals and activities with the right kind of focus and support, I can make progress towards being honest over the course of months, years, and decades.
That makes me think of psychotherapy, just to cut in a little bit, because there's that same sort of tension or debate in psychotherapy, depending upon the school of thought and so on. Some of the, particularly psychoanalytic and other depth psychologies, have a sense that it's going to take some time to make deep changes. And that's kind of similar to what you're saying. It just made me think of.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know much about that area, but that sounds exactly right as far as what personality psychology is suggesting, and certainly what philosophers have said, going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. Which it's a two-edged sword here. On the one hand, it's good news that character can change. I mean, it's a positive. So there is hope that we can change it in a positive. Make progress towards virtue. On the other hand, it's slow, so there's no quick fixes here. There are no pills to take, no fingers to snap to make yourself a virtuous person. And it's not also a linear process. So it's not like you're guaranteed to always make progress towards virtue. You could also make progress towards vice, or you could make some gradual progress towards virtue and then have a setback, and then make more progress and have a setback as well. So there's no recipe that's guarantee you a way to bridge the character gap.
Mm-hmm. And Yeah. So you said that the conclusion you've been led to is that we are a mix,
That's right.
uh, and we're not all good. We're not all evil, and that certainly fits with my life observation, and probably partly my orientation as a psychologist. And what drew me to psychology was, as I got to know people, as I got to know my friends in high school and so on, everybody has a story,
Right.
and nobody is ever, you don't get the whole story just on the surface of how they present themselves. If you get to know them better, and if they open up and start to tell you the story, you discover all sorts of uh, tragedies and pain that they're carrying, for example.
Right. Right. So you're absolutely right about how I'm thinking about this. So I'm thinking of it as mixed character. So some good sides to our character and some bad sides. So let me illustrate that. You invited me to bring in some psychological studies. So let me do that here. Let me give you a illustration of research which is positive, and an illustration of research which I think is less positive. So on the positive side, I'm thinking of Dan Batson's research on empathy and altruism. So he's a psychologist recently retired from the University of Kansas, who I think did stunning work over the course of 30 years on the relationship between empathy, feeling empathy for the suffering of other people, and helping them. So he found consistently time and time again in his studies that when people feel empathy for the suffering of strangers, they're more likely to help those strangers than our controls. And this is the really fascinating part. He constructed a motivational story. Why are they more likely? And his motivational story is that it's for selfless, altruistic reasons, to actually benefit those people, to help them, regardless of whether you benefit or are helped in the process. So it might actually come at your expense that you have to help them, but that's okay because your focus is on benefiting them and not yourself. So this, if he's right, this is tremendously positive. We have psychological capacities to help others, and to do so for selfless, not egocentric or egoistic reasons. So that's one side of the story I want to tell. Now, on the other side, we can change moral topics to cheating. I could have given an example of not helping, but let's just mix it up here a little bit with cheating. Research much more recently, in the last 10 years, looking at students and their desires to cheat in different situations. So you give a group of students a 20 problem test, and they're going to get 50 cents per correct answer. So it's not a normal test in a classroom environment. This is a special experimental test. 20 problems, 50 cents per correct answer. In the control group, they take the test, turn in their answer sheets. The answer sheets are graded by the experimenter in charge. They get paid accordingly. We're done. On average, these participants get 7 problems correct. A different group of participants has the same test, same incentive, monetary incentive. They sit down, they take the test, but this time they grade the test themselves when they're done. They shred all their materials and they verbally report how many they got correct. Well, there's no evidence, there's no paper trail here, so they can say whatever they want. They could say, of course, say the honest thing, which on average would be 7. But instead, the average in this group is 14. Put it in quotation marks, 14 correct. It could be that this group is so much smarter. I think the much more likely explanation here is that there was some cheating going on. I think it's just overwhelmingly more plausible. So here's evidence that in situations where we know we can get away with it, and there's some reward associated with cheating, we're likely to try to cheat. That's not so morally positive. That's a failure of honesty. And hence, you put these two pieces together. On the one hand, the empathy and helping, that's very positive. On the other hand, the cheating, when you can get away with it, that's negative. The result is mixed. And those are 2 illustrations. If that was all I had to say, that would be pretty disappointing. But there are many other examples like that, which collectively paint this picture of mixed character.
Yeah, of mix. On the cheating one, I'm wondering about the context of culture. You
Mhm.
know, might that come out very differently in some other sort of culture than ours, which is kind of aggressively individualistic and pretty self-serving?
That's a great question. And the short answer, as far as rigorous testing is concerned, is we don't know.
Hmm.
But the interesting side to that is that there are currently replications in the works. So as you know, there's a replication crisis going on in psychology, and this particular study is one that people are wondering, can we replicate these results? Not just with American participants, but let's set up labs around the world and use the same design and see what the results end up being. So we don't know yet, but probably in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll start seeing some data emerging.
Yeah, and it's too bad that we are losing, quote, the primitive cultures, which would be so valuable
Mhm.
to have as controls,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
And but as the whole world becomes so much more homogenous, some of those questions are going to be out of our reach, I
That's right.
think.
That's right. That's right. So it is a shame for sure.
Yeah. Now, there's a section in your book where you're talking about the research, and you mentioned helping and cheating. Uh, in this section, you also talk about harming and lying.
Mhm.
So, give us some examples from each of those.
Sure. So the harming, we've alluded to one example is Milgram again. So let's maybe go into that a little bit more detail, especially for listeners who are not familiar with the Milgram research, and why I think it's helpful as a clue about what our character is like. So here, participants, I'll just give a quick survey overview of it. Here, participants were coming into a lab one at a time. They were asked to give a test to someone in the next room. For every wrong answer the person in the next room got, they were supposed to turn up a dial. More the dial goes up, more shock would be administered to the person in the next room. There was different levels of shock on the dial, culminating in the XXX level, which presumably was going to be really severe, painful shocks. In addition, there was an authority figure standing behind the participants who, if need be, didn't have to say anything, but if need be, would kind of nudge the participant on with some prompts like, please continue. And so, of course, it was as well staged. There was no actual shocking going on. The test was rigged in such a way that there'd be a fair number of wrong answers, so there would be pressure to keep turning up that dial. And in the main version of the Milgram study, he did a number of different variants. In the main version, over 50%, roughly 66% of participants would continue to turn that dial all the way up to the XXX level, despite screams coming from the next room, pounding on the wall, reports of, I have a heart condition. So the person takes it, I have a heart condition, my chest is hurting, get me out, I don't want to participate in this anymore. Nevertheless, majority of participants would continue under pressure from that authority figure, bang that authority figure, continue to turn up that dial all the way up to the XXX level. That, to me, is quite disturbing. I mean, that's such a silly thing to say, and that's just really, really, really troublesome.
Yeah.
And there's more to it, though. And this is, again, why it's mixed character. Because Milgram had other versions which don't get nearly the attention as that famous version does. So he had other variations of the setup, for example, where there was no authority figure. It was just the participants and the person in the next room. Or he had a version where there are two authority figures and they were arguing with each other. They couldn't agree. Or he had a version where rather than being in the room with the participant, the authority figure was in another room and was phoning on the phone, calling in the instructions. And I mention these because in these other scenarios, obedience was much lower. Shocking was much lower.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't that people just enjoyed administering the shocks, and if they had an opportunity, they would do it for fun or take some kind of perverse pleasure in it. In fact, in many of the versions, there was very little shocking going on. The severity was low. It's, again, sometimes our character is admirable, what you would expect from a good person, but unfortunately, in other cases, it's not.
Yeah, it really makes for such a complex situation because it shows that it's always embedded in some kind of a context.
That's right.
And depending upon the context that it's embedded in, we may behave virtuously. The context can give us a nudge in the
Right.
virtuous direction, or it can give us a nudge in the other direction.
That's right. And the context sometimes it's clear what the contextual factors are, and the participants in that context can recognize them and understand what's going on. Other times, the contextual factors might be very subtle, and we might not even be aware that they're influencing our behavior. So to give you an example there, I also discussed in the book, smells, for example. The smell in the air can sometimes have a significant impact on whether people help or not. In a study from the 1990s, in a shopping mall, controls were just walking past clothing stores and then given an opportunity to help. About 20% of them did. In the experimental condition, participants they wouldn't even know they were participants. They were just shoppers in the mall. They had just walked past Mrs. Fields cookies or Cinnabons, or I don't know if you have them there, but Krispy Kreme or what other examples would have worked as well. And the smell was the key factor. Same helping task came along, same opportunity to help, and helping percentages jumped to the 60s. So 20s versus 60s on the same helping task, where the key variable that's different in the two groups is the smell.
Some kind of good, comforting food smell.
Right, and so the explanation that's offered, or at least the leading explanation, is that it's a comforting smell. It puts people in a good mood, and then that people want to maintain their good mood, and so they will look for opportunities to keep that good mood going, and helping is one such opportunity. So that helping opportunity provide a way to keep the good mood in existence.
Wow.
So I didn't mention that. It's a very fascinating study in its own right, but I just mentioned that because it's, I think, a really good illustration of the point you're making. That's the social and environmental factors can have a significant impact on behavior, and sometimes we're aware of them, and sometimes we're not. In this case, I guarantee you, the participants didn't have any idea that their helping was being influenced by the smell of the cookies. So.
Yeah, I find social psychologists diabolically clever.
Right.
With the schemes that they cook up to explore those kinds of issues.
Now, the downside of that, though, is replication. So sometimes these experiments are so clever, and they focus on one kind of nuanced variable in the environment, but then you wonder, can we replicate this result? If are other countries, other people, or is it going to be something that's so specific to that one day and time and group of participants, or is it getting at something deeper about human psychology? And it looks like right now we don't know. It looks like a lot of these experiments are in question.
Interesting. Well, one of the, you were talking about, well, how do we foster good character? How do we foster virtues? And that it's a struggle. And this would suggest that the solution is not just in the person.
That's right.
It's the question is as much how do we change organizational situations, school situations, prison situations,
right,
everything, right?
Right, that's right. So in the last few chapters of The Character Gap, having talked about this character gap, the fact that there's a gap between how we actually are and how we should be, I want to investigate some strategies for trying to reduce that gap or bridge that gap. And I go over a number of different strategies, some of which I find not very helpful, and some of which I find more helpful. And certainly one idea, and I think there are other ones too, but one idea is to pay a lot of attention to the social environment. So try to make, as much as we can, try to make sure that the social environment is conducive to good behavior and ultimately to development of the virtues, and not the opposite. So it's if it puts pressure on people, it's pressure in a good direction and not in a negative direction. That, I think, is worthwhile and valuable, but it has its limitations too. I mean, the reality is, these days, we don't live in a perfect society. There are all kinds of pressures and dangers and temptations in our social situations. So I think, also need to take steps to try and make ourselves aware of them, so that we can wrestle with them and be on guard for them and deal with them as we come across them. And secondly, some things you're never going to get rid of. So, for example, smells again. Smells are always going to be with us, and so it's not getting rid of smells. It's how can we think about our character in such a way that smells, if they are present in our environments, are helpful for us, or noise, or being in a group. You're not going to be able to avoid being in a group, even in an emergency situation. We can't prevent all emergencies, and we can't prevent being in the groups. But we also want to think about, okay, if that's the social environment we're in, how can we act better to counteract the bystander effect, counteract fear of embarrassment, so that people are more willing to rise to the challenge in an emergency, as opposed to just going along with the herd and diffusing responsibility and saying, well, look, no one else did anything, so I'm not going to do anything either.
Yeah, it sounds like you're maybe referring to some research on how people behave in emergencies.
Right. So the context here is, and this is actually how I opened up the book, my first example in the book. So I think maybe that's a good place to start. Has to do with a person named Walter Vance, who was shopping in Target a few years ago on Black Friday. So Target was very crowded. Lots of people trying to get that good deal the day after Thanksgiving. And this man, who was 61 years old, had a heart attack. He collapsed to the ground. And for a number of minutes, no one did anything. They saw him. And it's not like this was, some isolated corner of Target. They saw him. They either turned around, or some people even stepped over his body. So this is a very troubling story, but it shouldn't be so surprising in the light of psychological research on groups. So going back to the 1960s, we had the Milgram studies, but you also had these very famous studies by Darley and others, where you would look at how people in a group context would respond to emergencies when no one else in the group did anything. So in one very famous version of this, a participant comes in, fills out a survey, is told to fill out a survey. Another person comes in who's a stranger, sits at the same table, given the same survey, is filling out as well. The person in charge, who's given the two people the surveys, leaves the room, goes into the next room. After a while, you can hear some noise, some climbing up a ladder. Then there's a big crash, and this woman starts yelling, "Help, help, my ankle. I think I've broken it. Please help me."
Wow.
Well, what would you do? I mean, you would expect that if that was you, you would help, right? And what would most people do? You would expect most people would do something. And the answer is, at least if this study is to be believed, is it really depended on what that stranger did in the room with you. So if that stranger, who was actually a Confederate, so actually an actor, but no one knew that.
Right.
If that stranger just kept taking that survey and did nothing, then overwhelmingly participants kept taking that survey and did nothing themselves. So to give it a specific result here, only 7% of participants helped in any way. Not 70, 7%. Very discouraging number. In contrast, when in a different version, the participant was by him or herself, with no stranger present, 70% helped in that emergency. So 70 versus 7%. And this has been replicated time and again. There are also variations of it involving electric shocks and bullying of children and stealing going on, as opposed to someone who's been hurt. So there are lots of ways in which it's been found to be true that people in groups tend to not help if no one else is helping, even if it's a severe emergency.
Yeah.
So I think about that, and now to come back to your question about improvements, I think about that, and I think, look, we want to design great social situations and social institutions and social environments, but again, people are going to be groups and they're going to be emergencies. So we also want to think about ourselves and what we can do to better prepare ourselves if we might be in that kind of situation. And one thing, it might sound trite or platitudinous, but one thing is just to be aware of this research. So knowledge of the research is actually something that looks like it's effective. It's not 100% effective, but a helpful corrective against the bystander effect. And there's a follow-up study, and I'll stop. I know I've given you a long answer, but there was a follow-up study in the 1970s which said, let's see the impact of learning about this research on this very problem. And what they found was control groups, again, in a staged emergency, helped about 20% of the time. So a little bit better than 7%, but not great. But for people who had attended a lecture, these were students, the students who had attended a lecture where they learned about this research, and then subsequently were 2 weeks later confronted with an emergency. So not immediately, of course, the same day, well, yeah, obviously it's fresh in their mind, but 2 weeks later, confronted with an emergency, 42.5% of them helped. So 42.5 versus 20s, that's a pretty good improvement. So
Yeah.
that's something to think about.
Yeah, so there's a sort of, I don't know if inoculation is the right word, but
I would say education.
education.
Yeah, inoculation makes it sound like it's going to take care of the problem completely. Like inoculate it with the vaccine, so I'll never get that disease. But unfortunately, it's not that straightforward.
Right.
So I call it getting the word out.
Yeah.
Helping to educate.
Yeah, I don't know if this takes us off into too different an area or not, but what about, there are good reasons to want to shape behavior of individuals and groups. And so we've got the idea of education and good social structures versus the notion of social engineering, which has a sort of bad connotation attached to it. And that we sort of resist, if we know that we're being manipulated, sometimes we want to push up against that.
Right, and it really depends on the details here. So if the manipulation is one that still gives us options, but maybe makes certain options more appealing than others, kind of incentivizes certain options over others, that's one thing. If the manipulation is one that just takes away all other options and just limits us to one path, and the society is saying, we've determined what the right thing to do is, we're going to engineer your environment and your life for you so that you can only go down this one path because we think that's best for you, then I think that's we're right to be nervous about that.
Yeah. And as you pointed out early in the beginning, one of the sources of learning and thinking about all these things is fiction. And a lot of these scenarios have been explored in science fiction, for example.
Right. Utopian novels, which like 1984, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451, which explore what a society that really wants to engineer its citizens might look like. And the point of the book is not to kind of celebrate those societies or try to get people to bring them into real life. It's to actually do the very opposite, to caution us about the dangers of those societies and how they can take away freedom and really make people worse off.
Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. Is there anything that you'd want to get in here before we wrap it up?
Other than just, I want to thank you for your time and having me on your show, and emphasize that this book, The Character Gap, is really written for a non-academic audience. So unlike my previous research, this is a trade book. So if listeners are not philosophers or not trained psychologists, it should make a difference. It's intended to be written for a wide audience, and so hopefully it'll be helpful for readers.
Great. Do you have a website that you'd like to refer people to?
I have my own website, but I think maybe the easiest is to go to Facebook or Twitter. I'm at Character Gap at both Facebook and Twitter. Or yeah, the book is easy to find at Amazon and other booksellers there.
Sure, sure. Okay. Well, Christian B. Miller, Dr. Christian B. Miller, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed it.